I told Fyalar what it felt like to be me, just me, out for a long ride in the mountains. Do you understand what an adventure this is for me? Remember that I've always just laid on my kitchen sofa. Don't think that I've forgotten Jonathan for a single minute, or else I'd shout so that it rings throughout the mountains, just because this is so wonderful. Yes, it was wonderful. Jonathan would understand that I thought it was. What mountains? Just think that they are so high, and that there are so many small, clear lakes, and rushing streams, and waterfalls up in the mountains. And here I sit, Scotty, on my horse, looking at it all. I didn't know that anything in the world could be so beautiful. That's why I was completely astounded at first. But that gradually changed. I found a little riding trail. It was probably the one that Jonathan had talked about. It twisted and curved through the mountains. That's how you got to Wild Rose Valley, he had said, and twist and curve it certainly did. Before long, I turned away from the wildflower meadows. The mountains became wilder and more terrible, and the trail became more dangerous to move along. Sometimes it climbed up, sometimes it dropped down, sometimes it wandered by rock ledges alongside enormous cliffs. And then I thought I'd never manage. But Fyalar was certainly used to walking on dangerous mountain trails. Yes, he was fine, Fyalar. Later in the evening we were tired, both my horse and myself. Then I struck camp for the night. Oh, a little green patch where Fyalar could graze, and close to a stream where we could both drink. Then I made a campfire. For my whole life I had longed to sit by a campfire, because Jonathan had told me how wonderful it was. And now Scotty, at last you'll know how it feels, I said loudly to myself. I collected dry branches and twigs and a large pile and lit a campfire that burned and crackled so that sparks flew, and I sat by my fire and thought that it was exactly as Jonathan had said. I felt good as I sat there and looked into the fire and ate my bread and chewed my mutton. It was so good. I just wished that I had gotten it from someone other than Hubbard. I was glad, and I sang a little to myself. My bread and my fire and my horse. My bread and my fire and my horse. I couldn't think of anything else. I sat like that for a while, and I thought of all the campfires that had burned in all the wilderness areas of the world since time began, and how they had died out long ago, but mine burned here and now. It grew dark around me. The mountains became so dark. Oh, how dark it was, and how quickly it happened. I didn't like having my back to all that darkness. It felt as if someone could come up on me from behind. Besides, it was time to sleep, so I fed the fire well and said good night to Fyalar, and rolled up in my blanket as close to the fire as I could go. And then I wished that I would fall asleep right away, before managing to scare myself. Well, great, I can scare myself pretty easily. I don't know anyone who can do that as quickly as I can. Thoughts began running around in my head. Surely someone was lurking out there in the darkness, and surely the mountains were teeming with Tengil's spies and soldiers, and surely Jonathan had died long ago. My thoughts continued, and I didn't sleep. Just then the moon rose up behind the mountain top. Well, I don't think it was the regular moon. It looked similar, but I've never seen moonlight like that before. Of course, I've never seen moonlight over tall mountains either. Everything looked so strange. I was in a mysterious world of only silver and black shadows. It was certainly beautiful and a little sorrowful in a lovely, strange way, but eerie too. Even though it was light where the moon was shining, Many dangers could be hiding among the shadows. I pulled the blanket over my eyes because I didn't want to see anything more. But then I heard something. Yes, I heard something instead. A howl far away in the mountains, and then several howls a little closer. Violar neighed. He was scared, and then I understood what it was. Wolves were howling. Someone as scared as I was could have easily almost died from fright, but when I noticed how anxious Violar was, I tried to be brave. Violar, wolves are scared of fire, didn't you know? I said, but I didn't really believe it myself, and the wolves hadn't ever heard it either, because I saw them closer now. Horrible gray shapes came streaking out in the moonlight, howling from hunger. Then I howled too. I shouted to the heavens. I've never let out such a cry, and I know it frightened them a little, but not for long. Soon they were back again, even closer now. Their howls made Violar wild, and me too. I knew we would both die, Violar and I. I should be used to it, because I had already died once. But then I had wanted to. Then I had longed for it, and now I didn't want to die. Now I wanted to live and be with Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan, if only you could come and help me. They were so close now, the wolves. One of them was bigger than the others and more brazen. It was probably the lead wolf. He was the one that would bite me, I knew. He circled around me and howled so that my blood froze. I threw a burning branch at him and screamed loudly, but it only annoyed him. I saw his mouth and his terrible grinding teeth that wanted to slash my throat. Now, Jonathan, help. Now he's jumping. But then, what in the world happened then? In the middle of his leap, he gave a yelp and fell down by my feet, dead. Absolutely stone dead. And right through his head was an arrow. From whose bow did this arrow come? Who had saved my life? Someone strode out of the shadows behind a rock. None other than Hubbard. There he stood, sneering a little as usual. Yet I wanted to rush over and to him and hug him. I was so happy to see him at first, but just at first. I arrived just in time, he said. Yes, you definitely did, I said. Why aren't you at home at Knight's farm, he said. What are you doing here in the middle of the night? And you, I thought, because now I remembered who he was. What cunning treachery would take place here in the mountains tonight? Oh, why was it a traitor who saved me? Why must I be grateful to Hubbard? Not just for the mutton, but for my whole precious life. What are you doing here in the middle of the night? I said sullenly. Shooting wolves, as you've noticed, said Hubbard. Besides, I saw you when you rode out this morning, and it occurred to me that I should see that nothing dangerous happened to you. That's why I followed you. Yes, just your lies, I thought. Sooner or later you'll have to deal with Sophia, and then I'll pity you. Where is Jonathan? Said Hubbard. The one who is hunting wolves should have been here to shoot a few of them. I looked around. The wolves had vanished. Every one. They had probably been frightened when the lead wolf fell down and died, and maybe they mourned too, because I heard sorrowful little howls far away in the mountains. Well, where's Jonathan? Persisted Hubbard, and then I had to lie too. He's coming soon, I said. He set out after a pack of wolves way over there, I said, and pointed toward the mountain. Hubbard sneered. He didn't believe me, I noticed. Shouldn't you come home with me to Cherry Valley then, he said. No, I must wait for Jonathan, I said. He'll probably be here any minute. Really, said Hubbard. You don't say, he said, looking at me strangely, and then he pulled out a knife from his belt. I gave a little cry. What was he going to do? As he stood there in the moonlight with the knife in his hand, He frightened me more than all the wolves on the mountain. He wants me dead. Went through my head. He knows that I know that he's the traitor. That's why he followed me, and now he wants to kill me. I began to shake. I was so brave. Don't do it, I cried. Don't do it. Don't do what? Said Hubbard. Don't kill me, I cried. Then Hubbard turned white with rage. He rushed toward me and came so close that I almost fell backward. I was so scared. You little rascal, what are you saying? He grabbed my hair and shook me. You silly beast, he said. If I had wanted to see you dead, I could have let the wolves take care of that matter. He held the knife right under my nose, and I saw what a sharp knife it was. I used this to skin wolf hides, he said, not to kill dumb kids. I got a kick on the bottom so that I fell forward, and then he got started skinning the wolf. He swore the whole time he did it. And I hurried over to get on Fyalar, because now I wanted to get away from here. Oh, how I wanted to get away from here. Which way are you going? Cried Hubbard. I think I'll ride and meet Jonathan, I said, and I heard how scared and frightened I sounded. Yes, you do that, muttonhead, shouted Hubbard. Take your own life then, I won't stop you any longer. But by then I was in full speed away from there and didn't bother with Hubbard. In front of me, in the moonlight, the path twisted farther up over the mountain. A gentle moonlight it was, but clear, almost like daylight, so that you could see everything. What luck! Otherwise I would have been lost. Because there were steep slopes and chasms that made me dizzy, how horrible it was and how beautiful. It was like riding in a dream. Yes, this whole moonlit landscape could only happen in a pretty wild dream, I thought, and I said to Fyalar, who do you think is dreaming this? It's not me. It must be someone else who can dream up something both unnaturally horrible and beautiful, maybe God. I was tired and sleepy and could hardly hold myself up in the saddle. I had to rest somewhere for the night. Hopefully there won't be any wolves, I said to Fyalar, and I think he agreed with me. Who had tread up this mountain path between Nangiala's valleys from the beginning? Who had decided where this path to Wild Rose Valley would go? Was it necessary for it to twist along on such miserable little rocky ledges, beside such frighteningly steep slopes? I knew that if Fyalar took so much as one misstep, we would fall down, both of us, into the depths. Then no one would ever, throughout eternity, know what had happened to Carl Lionheart and his horse. It got worse and worse. In the end, I didn't dare open my eyes. If we were to plunge into a chasm, then I didn't want to see it. But Fyalar tread without any missteps. He managed, and when I dared to look again, we had come to a little glade, a fine, green little glade which had sky-high mountains on one side and a deep chasm on the other. Here's our place, Fyalar, I said. We're safe here from the wolves. And it was true. A wolf couldn't climb down those mountains. They were too steep. A wolf couldn't climb up out of the chasm. The cliffs were too steep. If a wolf came, it would surely have to use this awful little path along the chasm like we did, but I decided to think that a wolf probably wasn't that shrewd. Then I saw something really good. There was a deep cleft right through the mountain. You could almost call it a cave, because there were large blocks of rock for the roof. In the cave we could sleep safely with a roof overhead. Someone had rested in this glade before me. There were ashes left from a campfire. I almost felt like making one too, but I didn't have enough energy. Now I just wanted to sleep. So I took Fyalar by the reins and led him into the cave. It was a deep cave, and I said to Fyalar, There is room here for 15 like you." He neighed a little. Maybe he longed to be back home in his stall. I asked him for forgiveness since I had dragged him into such hardships, and I gave him oats and pet him and said good night to him again, and then I rolled up in my blanket in the farthest, darkest corner in the cave and slept like a rock before I had time to scare myself a little bit. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but suddenly I sat up and was wide awake. I heard voices and I heard horses neighing outside my cave. It was enough. A huge wild terror swept over me again. Who knows, maybe the people talking out there were worse than any wolves. Drives the horses into the cave so we have more room, I heard a voice say, and at once 2 horses strode in toward me. They neighed when they noticed Fyalar. And Fyalar neighed back. Then they were quiet, and they probably became friends in the darkness. No one in the glade outside must have realized that it was a strange horse they'd heard, because they continued talking calmly to each other. Why had they come? Who were they? Why were they up here in the mountains at night? I must find out. I was so scared, my teeth chattered, and I wished I were 1,000 miles away from here. But I was here, and very close to me were some people who could be friends, or just as easily be enemies, and I must find out which, no matter how frightened I still was. So I laid down flat on my stomach and began to crawl toward the voices out there. The moon was in the middle of the entrance to the cave, and a beam of moonlight fell right on my hiding spot, but I kept myself in the darkness by the side and crawled slowly closer to the voices. They sat out in the moonlight and were building a campfire, 2 men with rough faces and black helmets on their heads. It was the first time I'd seen some of Tinjil's spies and soldiers. I knew what I was looking at, believe me. I knew that here were 2 of the cruel men who had joined up with Tinjil to destroy Nangiala's green valleys. I didn't want to fall into their hands. I'd rather have the wolves get me. They talked secretively to each other, but in the darkness I was close to them and I heard every word. They certainly were angry at someone, because one of them said, "I'll slice his ears off if he doesn't arrive on time this time too." And then the other one said, "Yes, he needs to learn. We sit here and wait in vain, night after night. What makes him so useful, really? Shooting doves which carry letters is fine, but Tinjil wants more than that. He wants to have Sophia in Katla Cavern, and if this man can't arrange that, then it's a pity for him." Then I understood which man they were talking about, and who they waited for. It was Hubbard. Calm down a little, I thought. Just wait until he's done skinning the wolf, then he'll come. Believe me, he'll turn up on that path over there, the one who will catch Sophia for you. Shame burned inside of me. I felt ashamed because we had a traitor in Cherry Valley, but I still wanted to see him come. Yes, because now I would finally get proof. It was one thing to suspect someone, but now I would know for sure, so that I could say to Sophia that Hubbard, make sure you get rid of him. Otherwise, it'll be the end of you and us and all of Cherry Valley. How terrifying it is to wait, when you're waiting for something so terrifying. A traitor is something terrifying. I felt it crawling within me as I laid there. I almost stopped being scared of the men by the campfire, because of this strange feeling that I'd see the traitor arrive soon on the horse, there on the path as it curved around the cliff. I dreaded it, yet I stared so that my eyes stung toward the spot I knew he would appear. The 2 by the campfire stared in the same direction. They also knew where he would come from, but none of us knew when. We waited. They waited by the fire, and I waited flat on my stomach in the cave. The moon had moved away from the entrance to the cave, but time certainly stood still. Nothing happened, we just waited. We waited until I wanted to jump up and shout, to get it over with. It was as if everything waited, the moon and the mountains around us, the whole strange moonlit night, held its breath and waited for the traitor. And he came at last, far away on the path. In the middle of the moonlight, a rider approached on his horse. Yes, now I had him exactly where I knew he would appear. I shivered when I saw him. Hubbard, I thought, how could you? My eyes stung so that I had to close them, or maybe I closed my eyes so that I wouldn't have to look. I had waited so long for this scoundrel, and now that he was actually coming, it was as if I couldn't bear to see his face. So I closed my eyes and heard only from the plodding the horse's hoofs that he was approaching. At last he arrived and reined in his horse. Then I opened my eyes, because I needed to see what a traitor looked like, as he betrayed his own. Yes, I wanted to see Hubbard as he came to betray Cherry Valley and everyone who lived there. But it wasn't Hubbard, it was Jossie, the golden cockerel. Jossie and none other. It took me a moment to understand it. Jossie, he was so kind and happy and rosy-cheeked, and he had given me cakes and comforted me when I was sad. He was the traitor, and now he sat there by the fire just a little bit in front of me, together with Tinjil's men, Vetter and Catter, and he called them, explaining why he hadn't arrived earlier. Hubbard was hunting wolves in the mountains last night, and I had to hide from him, you see. Vetter and Catter still looked sullen, and Jossie said even more. Hubbard, surely you haven't forgotten him now. He should be in a cavern just like Sophia should be, because he hates Tinjil too. Then I think you should do something about it, said Vetter, because you're our man in Cherry Valley. Isn't that right? Said Catter. Yes, of course, said Jossie. He fawned and tried flattery, but Vetter and Catter didn't like him, I noticed. It must be true that no one likes a traitor, even if they have a use for him. He got to keep his ears anyway. They didn't slice them off, but they did do something else. They put Katla's mark on him. All of Tinjil's men must carry Katla's mark, even a traitor like you, said Vetter, so that you can show who you are if any spies who don't know you go to Cherry Valley. Yes, of course, said Jossie. They ordered him to open his shirt and jacket, and with a branding iron warmed in the fire, they burned Katla's mark on his chest. Jossie screamed when he felt the red-hot iron. Feel this, said Catter. Now you'll know forever that you're one of us, traitor that you are. Of all the nights in my life, this one was surely the longest and the hardest, at least since I'd come to Nangiala, and practically the worst thing was to lie there and listen to Jossie brag about his plans to destroy Cherry Valley. Soon he would trap Sophia and Hubbard, he said, both of them. But it must take place so that no one realizes who lies behind it. How else could I continue to be Tinjil's spy in Cherry Valley? You won't be a secret for long, I thought, because I will expose you, so that you'll become pale, you red-faced scoundrel. But then he said something else, Jossie, something that made my heart jump. Have you captured Jonathan Lionheart yet, or is he still loose in Wild Rose Valley? Vetter and Catter didn't like this question. I could see. We're on his trail, said Vetter. 100 men are searching for him day and night, and we'll find him even if we have to search every house in Wild Rose Valley, said Catter. Tinjil is waiting for him. I understand, said Jossie. Young Lionheart is more dangerous than anyone else. I've told you that, because he's truly a lion. I felt proud as I lay there that Jonathan was such a lion, and what a relief it was to know that he was alive, but I cried with rage when I realized that Jossie had done what Jossie had done. He had betrayed Jonathan. Only Jossie could have known about Jonathan's secret journey to Wild Rose Valley, and sent a message about it to Tinjil. It was Jossie's fault that 100 men searched day and night for my brother, and would hand him over to Tinjil if they found him. But he lived, just think, he lived, and he was free too, so why had he called for help in my dream? As I lay there I wondered if I'd ever know why. I found out many other things just by lying there and listening to Jossie. That Hubbard, he's jealous of Sophia because we've chosen her as leader of Cherry Valley, said Jossie. Well, it's because Hubbard thinks he's the best at everything. Oh, that's why. I remember how irritated Hubbard sounded that time when he asked, what's so special about Sophia? Oh, it was because he was jealous, not because of anything else. Anyway, you could be jealous and still be a good man. But I had felt from the beginning that Hubbard was Cherry Valley's traitor, and everything he said and did seemed to fit in with that. Just think how easily you could get the wrong idea about people. Poor Hubbard, he had watched over me and saved my life, and given me mutton and everything, and to think I had shouted at him, "Don't kill me." He wondered. No wonder he had been furious. Forgive me, Hubbard, I thought, forgive me. I would remember to say that to him if I ever met him again. Jossie was so sure of himself, he seemed quite smug as he sat there. But Katla's Mark probably smarted, because he groaned a little every time Gator said, "Feel that, feel that." I wish that could have seen what Katla's Mark looked like, though it was probably just terrible. I do believe so it was a good thing to avoid. Jossie continued to brag about everything he had done and everything he wanted to do, and right then he said, Lionheart has a little brother whom he loves more than anything else. Then I cried silently and longed for Jonathan. That poor little one could definitely be used as bait to hook Sophia, said Jossie. You numbskull, why haven't you mentioned this little one before, said Gator. The brother, if we had him, could be used to force Lionheart out of his hideout, because wherever he is, he would secretly find out that we've captured his brother. That would flush him out, said Vetter. Release my brother and take me instead. He'll say that if he really cares about his brother and wants to protect him from harm. Now, I was so scared that I couldn't even cry any more, but Jossie's head swelled and he boasted, I'll arrange it when I get back home, he said. I can lure little Killa Lionheart into a trap. It won't be difficult with a few cakes. Then we can deceive Sophia into coming to rescue. Isn't Sophia a little too clever for you, said Gator. Do you really think you can fool her? Oh, yes, of course, said Jossie, and she won't figure out who did it because she trusts me. Now he was pleased and chuckled to himself. Then you'll have both her and little Lionheart. How many white horses will Tinjil give me for this when he marches into Cherry Valley? We'll see about that, I thought. So, Jossie, you're going home to lure Lionheart into a trap. But if he isn't in Cherry Valley any longer, what do you do then? In the midst of all the misery, the thought of this made me a little happy. How disappointed Jossie would be when he found out that I had disappeared. But then Jossie said, Little Lionheart, he's nice, but he definitely isn't a lion. There isn't a more easily frightened little coward. Coward Heart is the right name for him. Well, I knew that myself, that I could never be brave, and that I shouldn't really be called Lionheart, like Jonathan, but it was still terrible to hear Jossie say it. I felt ashamed as I lay there, and I thought that I must try to be a little braver, but not right now when I was so scared. Jossie was finished at last. He didn't have any other evil deeds to boast about, and then he got up. I must be home before dawn breaks, he said. They urged him on until the last moment. Do something about Sophia and that little brother, said Vetter. Trust me, said Jossie, but don't harm the boy. I'm a little concerned about him. Thanks, I've noticed that, I thought. And don't forget the password if you come to Wild Rose Valley with information, said Cater, if you want to be let in alive. All power to Tinjil, our liberator, said Jossie. No, I'll remember that day and night. And Tinjil, he won't forget his promise to me either, right? He already sat in the saddle, ready to go. Jossie, chief of Cherry Valley, he said. Tinjil has promised, that's what I'll become. He hasn't forgotten. Tinjil forgets nothing, said Cater. And so Jossie rode away. He disappeared the same way he had come, and Vetter and Cater sat there and watched him leave. That one, said Cater, he'll be given to Katla when we're done with Cherry Valley. He said it so you realized what it would be like to be under Katla's power. I knew so little about Katla, but I still shuddered and almost pitied Josie, though he was such a coward. The fire out in the glade had burned down, and I began to hope that Vetter and Cater would also go away. I longed for them to disappear so much that it ached. Like a rat sitting in a trap, I longed to be let go. If I could just get their horses out of the cave before someone came in to get them, then I thought I could escape, and Vetter and Cater would ride away without ever knowing how easily they could have caught Jonathan Lionheart's little brother. But then I heard Cater say, we'll lie down in the cave and sleep for a while. Oh, now it's all over, I thought. Yes, it's just as well, because I can't go on now. Let them take me, let it all be over. But then Vetter said, why should we sleep? It'll be morning soon. And I have to get off this mountain. I want to go back to Wild Rose Valley now. And Cater gave in to him. As you wish, he said, bring out the horses. Sometimes when something is really dangerous, it's as if you save yourself without thinking. I threw myself backward and crawled into the cave's darkest corner. Just like a small animal would have done. I saw Cater come toward the opening, but in the next instant he was inside the coal-black cave, and I couldn't see him any more, just hear him, and that was terrible enough. He couldn't see me either, but he ought to have been able to hear my heart, how it beat while I lay there and waited for what would come, when Vetter found 3 horses instead of 2. They neighed a little when Vetter came in, all 3 Fialar too. I would know Fialar's neigh among 1,000 others, but Vetter the oaf, he couldn't hear the difference. He didn't notice that there were 3 horses in the cave. He drove out the 2 of them, closest to the opening, their own, and he followed after them. As soon as I was alone with Fialar, I rushed over to him and put my hand on his nose. Please, please, Fialar, be quiet, I begged silently, because I knew that if he neighed now, they would hear it outside and realize that something was wrong. And Fialar, he was so smart. He understood everything. The other horses neighed outside. They wanted to say goodbye to him, but Fialar stood quietly and didn't answer. I saw Vetter and Cater sitting up in their saddles, and I can't begin to describe how wonderful it felt. I'd soon be free now, and out of this rat trap, I believed. Then Vetter said, I've forgotten my tinder box, and so he jumped off his horse again and began to look around the campfire. Then he said, "It isn't here. Maybe I dropped it inside the cave." That's how the rat trap closed in on me again, with a thunder and a crash. That's how I got caught. Vetter came into the cave to search for that miserable tinderbox, and he walked straight into Fialar. I know you shouldn't lie, but if it's a matter of life or death, then you must. He had strong hands, Vetter. No one had ever held me so roughly before. It hurt, and I became angry, almost more angry than scared. Strangely enough, maybe that's why I lied so well. "How long have you been lying here spying?" roared Vetter as he dragged me out of the cave. "Since last night," I said. "But I've just been sleeping," I said, blinking in the morning light as if I'd just woken up. "Sleeping," said Vetter. "Are you saying that you didn't hear us bellowing and singing outside by the campfire? Don't lie now." He thought this was a cunning idea, because they hadn't sung a single note. But I was even more cunning. "Well, maybe I heard a little when you were singing," I stammered, as if I were lying just to satisfy him. Then Vetter and Cater looked at each other. Now they knew with complete certainty that I had been sleeping and hadn't heard a thing. But that didn't help me any further. "Don't you know that it's the death penalty for traveling this way?" said Vetter. I tried to appear as if I didn't know anything about the death penalty or anything else either. "I only wanted to see the moonlight last night," I mumbled. "And you risked your life for that, you little fox," said Vetter. "Where do you belong, in Cherry Valley or Wild Rose Valley?" "In Wild Rose Valley," I said, "because Carl Lionheart lived in Cherry Valley, and I'd rather die than let them know who I was." "Who are your parents?" asked Vetter. "I live with my grandfather," I said. "What's his name then?" asked Vetter. "I just call him Grandfather," I said, making myself look even more foolish. "Where does he live in Wild Rose Valley?" asked Vetter. "In a little white house," I said, because I thought that houses in Wild Rose Valley would be white like they were in Cherry Valley. "You'll show us this grandfather and this house," said Vetter. "Get up on your horse." So we rode, and just then the sun rose over Nangiala's mountains. The sky blazed like the reddest fire, and the mountain tops glistened. Never in my life have I seen anything more beautiful or anything more grand. And if Cater and his horse's black rump weren't right in front of me, then I would have been jubilant. Believe me, but I wasn't. No, I really wasn't. The path continued to curve and twist exactly as before, but soon it dropped down steeply. I realized that we approached Wild Rose Valley, yet I could hardly believe it when I suddenly saw it right below me. Oh, it was as beautiful as Cherry Valley, as it lay there in the morning light, with its little houses and farms, and its green slopes and flowering wild roses. There were entire drifts of wild roses. From up above it looked strange, almost like a sea with pink froth on the green waves. Yes, Wild Rose Valley was the correct name for such a valley, but I never would have reached the valley without Vetter and Cater, because there was a wall around all of Wild Rose Valley, a big wall that Tingill had forced the people there to build, since he wanted them imprisoned as slaves forever. Jonathan had told me that. That's how I knew. Vetter and Cater must have forgotten to ask me how I managed to sneak out of the enclosed valley, and I prayed to God that they wouldn't remember to either, because what could I answer? How could a person go over the wall, and with a horse as well? Tingill's men in black helmets and with swords and spears stood watch up on the wall for as far as I could see, and likewise a carefully guarded gate. Yes, there was a gate in the wall, right there, right where the path from Cherry Valley came to an end. For many generations people have traveled freely between the valleys. Now there was just one gate which was kept closed, and you had to be one of Tingel's men to go through. Vetter pounded on the gate with his sword. Then a little door opened, and a gigantic man stuck his head out. "Password," he shouted. Vetter and Cater whispered the secret password into his ear. It was probably so that I wouldn't hear it, but that wasn't necessary because I knew the words too. "All power to Tingel, our liberator." The man behind the door looked at me and said, "And that one, who's he?" "He's a little fool we found up in the mountains," said Cater, "but he's not completely stupid because he managed to get past your gate last night. What do you say about that, Commander? I think you should ask your men how they conduct their watch at night." The men behind the door became angry. He opened the gate, but he was yelling and swearing and didn't want to let me in, just Vetter and Cater. "Into Katla Cavern with him," he said. "He belongs there." But Vetter and Cater were persistent. I would go in, they said, because I must prove that I hadn't lied to them. It was their duty to Tingel to find out, they said, and with Vetter and Cater as escorts I rode through the gate. Then I thought that if I ever got to see Jonathan again, he would get to hear how Vetter and Cater had helped me enter Wild Rose Valley. He would laugh about that for a long time, but I didn't laugh because I knew how rotten things were for me. I had to find a white house with a grandfather inside, or else I'd go to Katla Cavern. "Ride in front and show us the way," said Vetter, "because we need to have a serious talk with your grandfather now." I urged Fyalar along, and turned onto the path that ran right along the wall. There were plenty of white houses, just like at home in Cherry Valley, but I saw none that I dared to point out, because I didn't know who lived there. I didn't want to risk saying, "Grandfather lives there," because what if Vetter and Cater strode in, and there wasn't so much as one little old man? At least no one who wanted to be my grandfather. Now I was really in a fix, and I was sweating as I rode. It had been so easy to lie about a grandfather, but now I thought that it wasn't such a good idea. I saw people working outside their houses, but nowhere did I see anyone who resembled a grandfather, and I felt more and more miserable. It was also horrible to see how things were for the people of Wild Rose Valley, how pale and hungry and unhappy they all were. At least those that I saw along my ride, so different from the folks in Cherry Valley. But then we didn't have Tingel either, in our valley, treating us as his slaves and taking from us all that we lived on. I rode and rode. Vetter and Cater began to get impatient, but I just rode as if I were on the way to the ends of the earth. "Is it much farther?" asked Vetter. "No, not particularly," I said, but I didn't know what I was saying or doing. I was frightened out of my wits now, and I was just waiting to be thrown into Katla Cavern. But then a miracle happened. Believe it or not, outside a little white house next to the wall, an old man sat. On a bench, feeding his doves. Maybe I wouldn't have dared to do what I did if there hadn't been one that was snow white among all the gray doves, only one. I got tears in my eyes. I had only seen doves like that with Sophia, and one time at my window far away in another world. And then I did something that was unheard of. I jumped off a Fyalar, and with a few skips I was in front of the old man. I threw myself into his embrace, and with my arms around his neck I whispered in despair, "Help me, save me, say that you're my grandfather." I was so scared and sure that he would push me away. When he saw Vetter and Cater and their black helmets behind me, Why would he lie for my sake and possibly end up in Katla Cavern for it? But he didn't push me away. He held me and kept me in his embrace, and I felt his good, kind arms around me, like a shield against all evil. Little boy, he said so loudly that Vetter and Cater would hear, why have you been gone so long, and what have you done, unfortunate child, to come home with soldiers? My poor grandfather, what a lecture he got from Vetter and Cater. They scolded and said that if he didn't take better care of his grandchildren, and if he let them wander around Nangiala's mountains, then soon he wouldn't have any grandchildren left, and they would see that he'd never forget it. But they would let it go this time, they said at last, and so they rode away. Soon their helmets appeared only as small black spots along the valley hillside below us. Then I began to cry. I was still in my grandfather's arms, and just cried and cried, because the night had been so long and hard, and now it was finally over, and my grandfather, he held me. He just rocked me a little, and I wished, oh, how I wished that he was my real grandfather. I tried to say that to him, although I was crying. Yes, of course, I can be your grandfather, he said, but just call me Matthias. What's your name? Carl Lyle, I began, but then I kept silent. How could I be so crazy to say that name here in Wild Rose Valley? Dear grandfather, my name is a secret, I said. Call me Scotty. Yes, of course, Scotty. And Mattis and he laughed a little. Go into the kitchen, Scotty, and wait for me there, he said. Then I'll just put your horse in the barn. And I went into a poor little kitchen with only a table and a wooden sofa and a chair and a fireplace and a large sideboard by the wall. Soon Mattis came back, and then I said, we have a large sideboard like this one in our kitchen too, back home in Then I was silent. Home in Cherry Valley, said Mattis, and I looked anxiously at him. Once again I'd said something now that I shouldn't have been mentioned. But Mattis didn't say anything more. He went over to the window and looked out. He stood there for a while and searched as if he wanted to be sure that no one was nearby. Then he turned to me and said in a low voice, there is something special about the sideboard. Wait until you see. He placed his shoulder next to it and shoved the sideboard aside. Behind it there was a shutter in the wall. He opened it, and inside was a room, a very little room. Someone was lying there on the floor, sleeping. It was Jonathan.